So here's the title of my talk, What Statistics Do Infants Learn in Statistical Learning Studies? I'd like to thank NIH for funding the studies, and Ansgar Endres, and in particular, Lauren Sloan, who are my colleagues on this work, and Lauren did a lot of the behavioral work that I'll be talking about. So I think I'll introduce statistical learning with this slide here, picking up on some of the themes that you heard already. So this represents the computer-generated speech stream that was used in one of the best-known statistical learning studies that we all know and love by Safran, Naslund, and Newport, consisting of this concatenated set of syllables that turns out to actually be pseudo words. So it would be something like go labu, tu piro, bida ku, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea is, given the regularity in the speech stream, dips in transitional probabilities, that is, breaks between the words, could mark word boundaries for a listener if you can pick up on those transitional probabilities. Transitional probabilities are higher within words, of course, than between words. The next thing I'd like to talk about very, very briefly is the idea that statistical learning is not necessarily limited to the auditory domain. Of course, we know that now. The first study, or one of the first studies to show visual statistical learning in infancy, was published in 2002 by Natasha Kirkham and John Slemmer and myself. And what we did was we presented a sequence, whoops, maybe it won't come up. There we go. A sequence of looming visual shapes in the center of the screen. And I have thoughtfully provided for you the sequence down below so you don't have to figure it out for yourselves. Every time I ask people to figure it out, they get very, very thoroughly confused. But here's the sequence, and you can see it consists of three pairs. There's a square cross, triangle circle, and diamond octagon. And these three pairs are always presented consistently, one after the other, but the pairs are randomly ordered. So statistical learning would be evident in observers being able to recognize the pairs when they're presented by themselves. So what we did was we used habituation, habituated young babies to the sequence that I just showed you. After habituation, which is a period of, we think, learning, in which the babies look at something or listen to something, and then we measure their attention. When their attention wanes across trials, we consider that habituation. In other words, they've learned. And the idea behind that is that after babies are habituated to something, they want to see something new. So we reasoned that after babies were habituated to the structured sequence, at test, if they see the same structured sequence, that is the one on the right, the one on the left, versus a random sequence, that is the one on the right, that they would show a novelty preference and look longer when the novel random sequence was on the screen versus the familiar on alternating trials. And that's exactly what we found. We tested 2-month-olds, 5-month-olds, and 8-month-olds, and you can see at every age, the babies look longer at the novel sequence. Now you can see also that 2-month-olds look a lot longer than 5- and 8-month-olds, but that's just because 2-month-olds look a long time at everything, basically. So here's a quote from our paper, and I no longer would defend these things, so I don't even know why I put it up there. But we claimed that statistical learning is a domain general device, and that's obviously not true. Well, maybe it's true. And we also, I'm not trying to be glib, I really don't know. And we also made the claim that it's functional with the onset of visual experience. So those are interesting claims, but it turns out that if what you mean by statistical learning is learning transitional probabilities, well, we didn't actually show that. In fact, Lauren Sloan and I did a study a few years ago looking at TP learning in infancy, and we found that using a design that's a little more similar to the Safran et al. Design, in which babies were habituated to a sequence pretty close to what I showed you, but at test, instead of showing a structured versus random sequence, they saw parsed pairs, one of which was familiar and another was novel, by the virtue of the fact that the familiar sequence, familiar pair has high transistor probabilities and the part pair has low transistor probabilities. So we reasoned that babies would show a novelty preference, right? Looking at the novel pair. 5-month-olds did that, 2-month-olds did not. So we claimed on the basis of this evidence that really young babies don't represent transistor probabilities. Not until 5 months do they do so. However, they're really not very good at it in this kind of paradigm. We tested 8-month-olds with a slightly more complicated sequence of 9 items, and showed at test three-item triplets rather, familiar and novel, and the 8-month-olds that we tested an awful lot of them, didn't really show any preference for the novel or the familiar. So what I'm going to talk about in this talk is what is represented in statistical learning studies. Is it transitional probabilities or is it chunks? So if babies remember transitional probabilities, they will simply remember the pairwise associations or lack thereof between different items. However, if they remember chunks, what is left for them to remember is actually the units themselves rather than the TPs within units. So I'm going to tell you first about an adult study using looming shapes of the kind that I told you about before, but in this case, there's a 10 location array, and we use 10 shapes that are loomed like this in a structured sequence. So I'm going to tell you about 4 studies with adults, and these aren't published yet, but we're writing them up now. The first 2 studies looked at what's called memory for illusory units. So here's how that works. We selected 9 shapes to show during a familiarization period. This is for adults. So they weren't habituated. We just let them look for a long time, either 10 or 20 minutes, and it turns out that didn't matter. We selected 9 shapes, and we organized them into triplets such that some of the shapes were shared across triplets. In fact, all of them were. Each shape appeared in 2 triplets. So the triplets you can see have 50% 0.50 transitional probabilities in between and 0.33 between triplets. What that allows us to do is, during test, we can create what's called illusory triplets. So illusory triplets were never seen during familiarization, but they have the same transitional probabilities, the same pairwise transitional probabilities as in the real triplets. So the question is, if babies learn triplets, if adults are learning triplets, rather than, in other words, chunks, rather than transitional probabilities, they'll be able to discriminate at test triplets from illusory triplets. So here's the design. We had 2 experiments. In the first experiment, we asked adults 2 things. If you see a triplet versus a part triplet, which one will you endorse as being more familiar? And if you see a triplet versus an illusory triplet, which one will you endorse as more familiar? In the second experiment, we asked adults to compare triplets versus part triplets, as in the first study, and also illusory versus part triplets. So here's what we found. We found that adults in experiment 1 endorsed both triplets when compared to both part triplets and illusory triplets. So that implies that the adults are representing these triplets really as chunks. Even though the illusory triplets had the same TPs, the adults discarded that information apparently and represented the triplets as chunks, discriminated them from the illusory triplets. However, in experiment 2, when adults were asked to compare illusory triplets versus part triplets, they actually endorsed the illusory triplets, even though they never saw them during familiarization. So we think that on the basis of these 2 experiments, this is evidence that adults represent both chunks and transitional probabilities, depending on the comparison. In experiments 3 and 4, we asked about memory for what we call embedded units. So here's the idea. Here, we familiarized adults with 10 shapes organized into 2 triplets and 2 pairs. You can see that the transitional probabilities within triplets and pairs is always 1, and between triplets and pairs, or between units, is always 0.33. So in these 2 experiments, we asked adults to compare real pairs versus part pairs, or embedded pairs. So an embedded pair is actually part of a triplet chunk versus a part pair. So if you represent the triplets as a chunk, you might lose the ability to recognize an embedded pair. So an analogy might be if you know the word elephant, you don't really have a representation of elef. Okay, so in the 4th experiment, we asked adults to compare pairs and part pairs and also embedded pairs versus pairs. And here's what we found. So in experiment 3, we found that adults endorsed pairs more than part pairs, which you'd expect. They also endorsed embedded pairs more than part pairs. So that implies that the adults are representing TPs and recognize the embedded pair as a result of that. So the stronger TPs of the embedded pair versus the part pair lead to this endorsement. However, in experiment 4, adults endorsed pairs over part pairs, of course, but they didn't discriminate between real pairs and embedded pairs. So the real pairs and the embedded pairs have identical transitional probabilities. So what this might indicate, because the adults couldn't discriminate them, is the TPs are the same, so they couldn't discriminate. So we think in both of these cases, adults are representing transitional probabilities. Okay, so adults represent both chunks and TPs depending on context. What about babies? That's my principal research interest. So what we did for some baby studies, and these were published in Cognition last year, is we used a simplified version of that 10-item task. We used a 5-item task, and we actually used 10 items in another study. I'll tell you about that in a second. But the idea is very similar to the adult study I told you about before. So in study 1, we asked if babies will have memory for illusory units. So in this case, we saw, the babies saw the 5 shapes. The 5 shapes are organized into 2 triplets and 1 pair. Notice that the triplets and the pair share some items. So the square appears in a couple of different units, as does the circle, as does the diamond. So what that allows us to do is create an illusory triplet with the same TPs as the real triplet. And of course, here's the part sequence. So the 2 models, the boundary finding model and the chunking model, make different predictions about whether babies should recognize the illusory triplet or not, just like in the adult study. So on the boundary finding model, illusory triplets will be the same as the triplets. They'll be considered the same, they'll be recognized the same because they have the same transitional probabilities, but the part sequences will be recognized as different. The chunking model, on the other hand, predicts that triplets will be recognized differently than illusory triplets because they have, because obviously the triplet is a chunk and the illusory triplet is not. And here's what we found. We found that babies, these are 8-month-old babies, looked longest at the triplet. They showed a familiarity preference for the triplet, looked longer at it than the part sequence and the illusory triplet. In other words, they treated the triplet, the babies treated the triplet and the illusory triplet as different. They seem to, in other words, endorse the triplet more than the illusory triplet, consistent with a chunking model, same as the adults. In a second study, we asked about babies' memory for embedded units. Again, the same sort of idea as I talked about with the adults. Here, we took the 5 shapes and organized them into a triplet and a pair. And those are shown up here. Just a single triplet and a single pair. Shapes were not shared across units in this case. So the transitional probabilities within units, like the triplet and the pair, were always consistent, always 1.0, and 0.5 in between units. The test sequences, just like for the adults, were a pair, an embedded pair, and a part pair. So again, the boundary finding model would suggest that embedded pairs will be treated the same as pairs because they have different, equivalent transitional probabilities, and part sequences will be recognized as different. The chunking model, in contrast, would suggest that embedded pairs will be treated differently than pairs because embedded pairs wouldn't be recognized in the same way. And what we found was, in this case, babies showed a novelty preference for both the part sequence and the embedded pair. In other words, they considered the pair as different than the part pair, consistent with the chunking model. Now, it's important to point out that we found a familiarity preference in study 1 and a novelty preference in study 2. And Lauren and I, in the paper that we wrote, it came out in 2018, we suggested that the babies in study 1 showed a familiarity preference because the task was really quite complicated. And in fact, very few of the babies habituated. Another difference between the 2 paradigms is that each unit here in study 1 was presented 50 times, and here in study 2, it was presented 80 times. Also, of course, there were no items shared across units in study 2. So all of these things go together to make study 2 less complicated, easier to learn perhaps in study 1. And notably, a lot more babies in study 2 habituated than in study 1, suggesting that the babies got bored, the babies learned, and so that's what we expect to lead to a novelty preference. So that was our interpretation. Study 3, which I'm not going to talk about, was simply a replication of study 2 with a larger n. The editor requested it, so we did it, and the results replicated almost perfectly. So I'll move now to study 4. which asked if babies would show the same chunking behavior if they had reduced exposure, reduced exposure to each of the units. We accomplished that by doubling the number of units, the number of items that the baby saw, using a 10-item array, the same one that the adults saw, instead of the 5-item array that I talked about for studies 1 and 2. So the 10 items were concatenated into, you can see there, two triplets, boom and boom, and 2 pairs, boom and boom, with transistor probabilities of 1 within units and 0.25 across units. At test, the babies didn't see, actually the babies did see 6 test sequences, which is quite a few, 2 pairs, 2 embedded pairs, and 2 part pairs. So the boundary finding model and the chunking model will make exactly the same predictions. Boundary finding model says that embedded pairs will be treated the same as pairs because of the similar transistor probabilities, and the chunking model would predict that embedded pairs would be treated differently. And what we found was, in fact, consistent with the boundary finding model. The babies seemed to find the part sequence novel, but not the embedded pair. So the embedded pair seemed to be considered, for the babies anyway, the same as the pair. And that would be consistent with the boundary finding model because they both have the same transistor probabilities. So one possibility for how this might work, the relation between boundary finding and chunking, is that one possibility, if you have this sequence here with transistor probabilities rising or falling depending on which pair you're looking at, one possibility is the babies or adults or whatever learn pairwise statistics first, and then they're lost. So it might be something like this. You go through the set, and doggone it, sorry about that. You go through the set, and you recognize that some of the adjacent pairs have very high transistor probabilities and some don't. So as you move through the learning phase, eventually those stronger TPs join those adjacent items into units, and eventually the TPs could be discarded because they're not needed anymore, and what you're left with is the chunks. So this idea covers pretty much all the results of the adults and the babies that I talked about. However, there's an alternate possibility. The alternate possibility is that babies might attend to the most reliable cue, and that cue might depend on circumstances. So for example, one thing that we didn't control for in study 1, the Sloan and Johnson paper, this is the baby study I told you about, is forward and backward transistor probabilities. Now we know from a number of studies that babies, in both visual and auditory stimuli, babies are sensitive to backward transistor probabilities. So what that means is if you see a triangle, did you have a representation that the square always came before it? That's a backward transistor probability. It turns out, well, in most studies, forward and backward transistor probabilities are equivalent. But in this study, they were not. It turns out the backward transistor probabilities were actually stronger for the illusory triplet and the part sequence than they were for, relative to the forward transistor probabilities. In the triplet, they were equivalent. But if you can look really, I'm sorry, it's kind of hard to see, but in the illusory triplet, the forward transistor probabilities are 0.5 and 0.5. But in fact, the backward transistor probabilities are different because of that one transistor probability, the 1.0, between the square and the triangle. So the backward transistor probability is 1, meaning the entirety, the average of the backward transistor probabilities in the illusory triplet was actually stronger than forward transistor probabilities. And it turns out that in the part sequence, the backward transistor probabilities were also stronger than the forward transistor probabilities. So if the babies were actually queuing into backward transistor probabilities instead of forward, then, in fact, illusory triplets and part sequences should be more familiar, which is really counterintuitive. But if backward transistor probabilities were the most reliable cue the babies were relying on, then sure enough, illusory triplets should be a stronger sort of a unit based on those backward transistor probabilities. And thus, it should be familiar. Same with the part sequence. And the triplet with the lower backward transistor probabilities should actually be more novel. And in fact, that's exactly what we found in study 1, if you remember. The babies seemed to show what we call the familiarity preference for the triplet, but if the babies were actually relying on backward TPs, it's actually the most novel test sequence. Another alternative possibility we didn't really consider was the fact that in experiments 2 and 4, there were a lot of immediate sequence repetitions. So what I mean by that is simply during familiarization, the babies, the sequences were pseudo-randomized so that you can have no more than 3 units in a row, but even so, there were a lot of units that were presented one after another, immediate repetitions. In fact, I just went and counted in the sequences the babies saw during study 2 and study 4, and it turns out that each unit repeated on average about 12 times in study 2, but only about 4 times in study 4. So this implies that even though the transistor probabilities were well controlled in studies 2 and 4, we did not control for immediate repetitions, which were much more frequent in study 2 versus study 4. So is there evidence that immediate sequence repetitions are a cue that babies use? Well, not in any published papers that I know of, but in an unpublished study that I told you about before, actually, when we tested 8-month-olds. Now, the 8-month-olds we tested were tested with habituation rather than with familiarization, which I didn't mention. Actually, I should have. In the Sloan and Johnson 2018 paper, studies 1, 2, and 4, these babies were habituated, which means the babies got really quite different kinds of inputs. Some babies looked a long time, some babies didn't look very long at all. And also the fact that it was pseudo-randomized meant that, in fact, the transistor probabilities in the novel triplet were free to vary. And in fact, they did vary. Babies, again, got different kinds of input. And as a consequence of that, the transistor probabilities of the so-called novel part pair were really wildly different. There was a big range. So the question is, did the babies sort of capitalize on these differences, say, in transistor probabilities, such that the part pairs with particularly low transistor probabilities would be the ones that would be most easily recognized as novel? So there should be a novelty preference for these things down here, and you can see there isn't. The babies made no use whatsoever of transistor probabilities in that study. However, when you look at frequency of immediate repetitions, in fact, there was, again, a big range. Some babies saw as many as 20% of the units that they saw involved some sort of a repetition. Some babies actually saw no repetitions whatsoever during habituation. And what we found was the babies who had the higher amounts of repetition actually showed a familiarity preference, suggesting that at some level they were able to parse out and recognize the familiar triplets. That's the end of my talk. I don't have a slide. But I wrote this like at 11 last night, and so, but you can see what we're after here is to try to figure out when transistor probabilities are learned and chunks are learned, and it's complicated, and we're still working on it very much.